So, welcome to our webinar on the future of the European electricity market. Electricity is on everybody's mind these days because of high prices, of course, but we also have the longer term goal of decarbonization and overall energy supply security, some say sovereignty, so many issues to discuss. My colleague Martin Borowiecki will present the results of our recent economic survey, which had a special chapter on the European electricity market. And I have a wonderful panel to present to you after that, which will then engage in the discussion. Don't be shy, ask your questions in the chat, and I'm looking forward to that. Martin, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Let me share my slides. So, just a second. Can you see the slides?
Yes, it's perfect. Off you go.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for attending today's seminar on EU electricity markets, which is a highly topical issue. Electricity markets are a key policy lever for achieving the EU's triple objective of competitiveness, energy security, and decarbonization, as Nicola introduced before. And we, in the 2025 OECD Economic Survey of the European Union and the Euro area, provides recommendations for delivering this transition from a legacy system anchored in fossil fuels towards an electrified economy centered on low carbon electricity generation. However, the major challenges remain on the way there. For instance, a major issue is the high electricity prices in the EU. EU electricity prices remain persistently higher than those of major trading partners, including the US. And this mainly reflects the dependence on imported fossil fuels, as well as high taxation. And this price gap between Europe and other countries discourages the electrification of the economy and the decarbonization. It also risks the relocation of energy-intensive industries instead their transformation. And more recently, we can also observe that electricity prices remain high in countries that are more reliant on gas-fired generation. On the marginal pricing, as we have in Europe, gas often sets the clearing price, which means that global gas shocks are directly transmitted to industry and consumers. In countries with higher shares of renewables and nuclear, on the other hand, we see lower electricity prices. Here, for example, in the chart, we see Portugal, Spain, which have a high share of solar energy. We also see France, which has a high share of nuclear energy. We see the Scandinavian countries with a high share of wind and hydro, and the Baltics, which have a high share of imported electricity from the Scandinavian. So again, wind and hydro. And these countries have indeed lower electricity prices now in April 2026. In this context of the current crisis, what can we do basically? So emergency support measures are necessary from the perspective of affordability, but they have high fiscal costs, and they have the risks of consumers increasing actually their fossil fuels consumption, which runs counter the EU's objective of reducing the imported fossil fuels reliance. So we say support should be targeted to most vulnerable households, maintain energy saving incentives, and have clear sunset clauses. And in the long term, it's important to focus on measures to enhance the electrification of the economy. And this is what the EU survey basically talks about. One issue is that electricity continues to carry a heavy tax burden, often exceeding those of gas, which discourages or which discourages the uptake of electrification. In this context, the EU Commission proposed to lower electricity tax rates below those of gas under a revised energy taxation directive. However, the revised directive is still in negotiations and progress has been very slow. In March of this year, the Commission also recommended that EU countries lower their national electricity tax rates to the EU minimum levels allowed under the current directive. So overall, reform is needed to reduce the heavy tax burden on electricity while phasing out subsidies and tax exemptions for fossil fuels. This was taxation. Now let me move to interconnections. The EU single market proved resilient during the last energy crisis, but a major bottleneck is limited physical interconnections between countries. This basically reflects that countries have different regulations, so it's not easy to build from one country to another country, and countries often do not agree on cost-sharing arrangements. So there is basically a market failure, and the reason for EU to step in here. But there's a lack of coordinated European level planning and limited funding for these cross-border connections. In this context, we recommend to empower the EU agency ACER to identify high-impact cross-border projects and reallocate resources to the Connecting Europe facility to bridge this investment gap. A third major challenge is competition. Entry barriers remain in many national markets, and they continue to protect or to shield incumbents from competition and make new entry more expensive. For example, in several EU countries, legacy state-owned companies continue to dominate generation and retail, while new entrants face complex administrative burdens. So here we say that lowering entry barriers could help drive down prices in the long term. And there has been also a paper by our OECD colleagues that has been published recently that go into the fine details of each specific countries, of each specific and provides examples of such barriers to new entry. In the OECD survey, we recommend. So basically, the EU already has rules for market access, but not all countries have implemented them so far. And we say that technical guidance for EU countries is needed on implementing these EU rules for market access. And this technical guidance should be paired with rigorous monitoring of EU rule implementation, including infringement procedures where progress stalls. There's also greater need for more supply and demand side flexibility to manage the intermittent nature of wind and solar power. So basically, when the sun does not shine and the wind does not blow. However, progress in battery storage capacity and in smart meter deployment is highly uneven across EU countries. This also relates to another issue, which is renewable support schemes. Many legacy or renewable support schemes lead to price insensitive generation, which can lead to inefficiencies at times of oversupply. So basically, support is granted for the producer, irrespective of the the market price. It's based on output. So the producer continues to deliver electricity even if there's an oversupply. The EU electricity market design reform from 2024 curbs subsidies during prolonged negative prices and promotes long-term market-based private contracts. However, in most EU countries, contracts for difference still pay based on output when prices are negative. This weakens incentives for example, to invest in storage. The EU state framework should target government subsidies to low carbon technologies without muting price signals. So then let me maybe summarize the key messages, which is first, increase investment in cross-border electricity grids through better EU-level coordination and planning. Second, reduce electricity taxation and levies to encourage switching from fossil fuels to electricity. Third, lower entry barriers for new market participants to drive down prices and encourage innovation. And fourth, transition toward market-responsive renewable support schemes to encourage producers to respond to price signals. And I think the fourth message is also important in the context of the economics of renewables. So basically, renewables share similar characteristics to digital markets where we have high fixed costs. So, for example, it's capital costs. It's costly to invest in new installations. But once these installations are running, the marginal costs are approaching zero. So basically, you can produce wind and solar. It's zero costs. So you have high fixed costs, low marginal costs. And this has different market implications for competition, the danger of concentration, and for price setting. So in the context when the marginal cost is zero, the price should be zero. But in this context, we would need to think of how to basically remunerate producers in a way that still sends them the signal to switch off when there's high supply. So this was basically my speech. Thank you very much. And I would like to pass on now to Nicola, I guess.
Yes. Thanks, Martin. Thanks for this introduction. I think it laid out all the issues. And I would now like to welcome my panel on the screen. We are very lucky to have electricity experts from a wide range of backgrounds. So first we have Allegra Kowalewski-Ferreira, and she's in the VC team of Breakthrough Energy, basically a funder for innovative energy technologies. Well, she can tell us a lot about the innovation landscape in that area. Welcome, Allegra. We have Antonio Lopez-Nicolas, who is the Chief Economist Energy at the EU Commission, of course, also instrumental for this subject. Welcome. Philipp Steinberg is a seasoned policymaker in the field of energy and decarbonization here in Germany, and now a strategy consulting in that same field. Good to have you, Philipp. And finally, we have Frauke Thies, last but not least, and she's from I think really also an electricity market expert from Agora think tanks. So think tank that basically specializes in the decarbonization of the economy. Of course, that's behind a decarbonization of the electricity system. And Frauke, perhaps I would like to start with you, because you also look at this this question from a think tank analytical point of view. And perhaps you can just tell us, if you look at the last points or the summary that Martin did, he's worried about taxes, the OECD is worried about the high taxation, that could be a disincentive to electrification, the interconnector grid capacity, and that's not powering ahead as we would like to see. He's also worried about competition and then more market responsive support schemes for renewables. Are these the points you're most worried about? Are there some that you would highlight more than others? Would just be interesting to hear your perspective.
Thanks a lot, Nicola, and thanks, Martin, for the very, very helpful, I think, framing of the discussion and indeed identification of key elements. And broadly, I would say, yes, absolutely, all four matter. They are intertwined, of course, as well. And maybe starting with the infrastructure one, which I think goes hand in hand quite a bit with the competition piece as well. Infrastructure, of course, both on the local level as well as at the transmission level, increasingly becoming a bottleneck for the transition, with very long connection queues, with simply insufficient infrastructure to balance demand and supply in an optimal manner across the continent. So absolutely share that priority. And there's lots of levers there. You pointed at the interconnection and the need to identify priority corridors. I absolutely agree. And at the bottom of that is the question, how do we plan infrastructure? How do we identify what is needed and what isn't? And if we look at it from the European perspective, at Agora, we have, together with Fraunhofer and Define, done a very detailed open source modeling where, unlike the current way of planning the grid, which is arguably still very much sector by sector, bottom up, to arrive at a European scenario, we did it the other way around. We did basically an integrated modeling that optimized across European countries and across vectors: electricity, hydrogen, gas, and CO2. And compared that with a business as usual case, still a fairly generous business as usual case, I would say. And on that basis, we basically found that with an optimized approach, Europe could save some 560 billion until 2050. If we take into consideration the reduced need for backup capacity in such an integrated world, we'd go up to 750 billion. Until 2050. So to give us an idea what optimized infrastructure could do. And from that perspective, of course, it could also help us identify which priority corridors are needed, should be supported. There's lots of elements behind it, like cost benefit, how do you share the costs, all of this. We can go further into that throughout the discussion, but just to say, absolutely agree on the infrastructure. To not make it too long on the other points, yes, the taxation, the power to gas price ratio, key element when it comes to electrification now. Europe is still heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels. We are sending hundreds of billions abroad every year for energy throughput that we could be investing in European generation capacity. Electrification based on clean homegrown electricity is the way forward. Currently, price signals don't always support that and sometimes even contradict that because the expenses, the taxes, the additional costs on the power price are still quite high. In some cases, especially when we look at low temperature electrification, it is still in the money. We've just done a business case analysis for industrial heat in Poland, Italy, Germany. In principle, it is already in the money thanks to the efficiency of heat pumps. So there it's more to look into more physical barriers, currently grid connections, waiting queues, and all the rest of it. But especially if we look into medium temperature, into households, it is really the cost ratio, which depends on the taxation and how the taxation is done. Competition, and I realize there's a lot more to be discussed, so I'll leave it here very briefly. Competition matters. What matters most for energy prices, though, is the number of hours during which gas is still determining the price in power markets. So that is the core element. Competition matters when it comes to cross-border. Competition matters when it comes to setting the right price signals, where Europe can still improve, especially in some of the European member states, where price signals are very much blunted, where bidding zones are not really reflecting what the costs are. And then it's also design of market access to include, for example, all flexibility options into balancing markets, capacity products, and so forth. I'll maybe leave it here.
Yeah, I
It's
think
more for the discussion.
let's perhaps go because you were stressing that so much and others were nodding. So I want to dwell on the infrastructure um, for a moment because that's really important, obviously. And Philipp, I think I saw you nodding. So were you in agreement about what Frauke said about the kind of infrastructure planning that had been done? Does that need to be more bottom up rather than top down, or where do you see the bottlenecks in the planning, so to speak, that lead to the physical bottlenecks?
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. The bottlenecks in the planning are, of course, the trans-European aspects. The OECD report rightly stresses, and in order to raise efficiencies in the European energy market, of course, we would have to develop a truly trans-European electricity market, as actually the OECD chapter on this actually rightly points out. Of course, the devil lies not so much in the economics, but in the doing. Of course, that is it's not a surprise here. If you see the fragmentation electricity markets, of course, Europe-wide auctions would be very welcome, but you need the network, and then in order for the network to exist, you need to overcome like all kinds of national reluctances. Of course, we are awaiting the European grids package, actually, which is of course might help with the distribution of revenues, with the planning procedural guidelines and all that could help. But that's certainly an important element. We have to incentivize member states to be less protective of their energy market. Having said that, of course, maybe one more general remark. I think the OECD report is highlighting a lot of things policymakers should follow or could follow, like lower taxes on electricity based on CO2 content. Of course, try to have more competition in the electricity market. Of course, we have a little bit the problem that marginal pricing logic, the merit order, is certainly something which is very much we don't have anything better, but of course it doesn't really solve the problem how to deal with super high prices, and we have all seen that is a practical problem. So the capacity market and markets we are developing and the European framework conditions are permitting, they need to be incorporated somehow into this modeling, which is difficult. So to sum up, yes, absolutely, we need more infrastructure planning. We need to Europeanize it, but we need to bear in mind the practical problems and the political economy behind it.
Sure. Allegra, we had discussed before. You're, of course, trying to support technologies that will help decarbonize the overall technologies that will help to decarbonize the overall economy. And you told me that the grid is really a bottleneck. So maybe you can expand on that a little bit so that we know that we're talking about the right thing. And what you hear from the companies that you support, where are the problems in your mind?
Yes, happy to. Thank you very much. So indeed, electrification is a major lever of decarbonization, but also energy sovereignty. And so I would like to share with you a couple of examples of, I would say, companies that we've backed that are trying to solve an issue related to the electricity market and what could be done and what's the potential to be seized. So one example is, I think, coming back to what you were saying, Frauke, on transmission. So we have a company called Thies Conductor that is using advanced conductors, and that allows to just change the transmission cable. You keep the existing pole, so you don't need to ask for a permit, and you can transport 3 times more energy. So that would effectively allow the expansion of the grid, which is a necessity if we want to electrify our economy as much as possible. There, the issue is standard. So they work with utilities and that need to abide to certain standards. And so from time to time, while those standards don't keep up with where the innovation is at, and so it got miscategorized. So that's an area where if we could make sure that standards basically evolve with technology development, that would be tremendously helpful. Second example is grid enhancing technology. So we invested in a company called Reactive that performs inertia and measurement and grid strength measurement. Sorry, somebody came in the room at the same moment. And there, in that case, what it allows is to avoid a renewable curtailments, which is key because more often than in some countries, the curtailment of renewables can go as high as 30%. So we produce green energy and then it goes down the drain. In that case, the issue is that utilities company are basically first and foremost incentivized to make a capex expenses rather than OPEX. And so if we would, at the end of the day, consider and also incentivizing utility company to make OPEX rather than systematically CapEx expenses, well, we could then benefit plainly from the potential of those technologies. Long duration energy storage. I mean, we want an increasing share of renewables. Most of those are intermittent. And so the price of renewables now is fairly low. The issue is its integration. We'll only see integration of renewables at a high level if we have long duration energy storage. And at the moment, those companies have a hard time to take off because the remuneration model is unclear. They can't sign long offtakes. And so at the end of the day, they have issues to deploy. And when we talk about long duration energy storage, we also need to talk about new generation. So whether it's geothermal, nuclear, but in that case, the obvious issue, and some of you have already discussed that, it's permitting. Getting a permit is not counted in years, but close to decades now. And so we're not in advance in terms of shifting away from our dependency on imported fossil fuels, and we're not in advance in terms of decarbonization. So if we could save some time on permitting, that would be tremendously helpful. Another example that I wanted to share with you is industrial heat. There's a certain number of processes that currently are working only on natural gas, which could be electrified. And there's a case in Europe actually for those to come to the market. But the issue here is twofold. One is the timeline to connect to the grid, which again, it's like permitting, it's close to be decades now. So we need clearer and more flexible rules in order to manage the queue to being connected to the grid. And the other is, if there's any form of price support when there's an energy shock, like now we're suffering from one because of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Then if you basically continue to subsidize natural gas, you effectively reduce the business case and the economic case to electrify. So we need to keep that in mind, is that those companies that are shifting away from natural gas to electrify industrial heat they basically are trying to fit their capex on the one hand and the cost of electricity on the other hand in between. And so we have to be careful when we design, I would say, support packages because there's an energy shock. And the last bit, to come back to what Frauke was saying, is the potential of AI. We have an opportunity here to use AI as a tool to better orchestrate the grid with new pattern of consumption, new pattern of generation, a much larger grid, a much more complex grid. But in order to do that, we need standardized data, and we need a better planning tools at the end of the day to allow us to spend more in a smart way the money we have in the grid package.
Great. Thank you, Allegra. And you will be happy to hear that this week, a little later, we will talk about another OECD study that looks into the barriers of renewable deployment and also storage deployment. And they do talk a lot about permitting and land planning procedures. So we are trying to look into these problems too. But Antonio, I feel that now so many points have accumulated for the chief EU energy economist, and I don't even know how to order them, but I'll try. So we heard from Philipp that he said, well, we would really need to have a common energy, electricity market, similar rules, similar pricing. I also saw different views. So we talked a lot about grid expansion and how that is needed. And in particular, perhaps I would like to hear from you about the interconnectors, why it's so difficult to make progress. And maybe in part that's money, no? Because there are many other priorities that are accumulating at the moment. And at least in the transition, they're not always in harmony, right? We expect to get lower prices at the end and more secure energy. But of course, as Martin said, high investments on the way to it. But I saw another point in the chat where somebody said, oh no, transporting energy is a bad idea. What we need is better local pricing. So that generation happens where electricity is needed. Perhaps I'll leave it there for the moment just to ask you, what would you like to have if you could really, you have all these member states with different interests, different legacies, of course. What is it you would need in order to really make progress to advancing the grid expansion, the electrification of the European economy, and hence competitiveness, secure energy, and decarbonization?
Thanks, Nicola, for the question. Thanks again for the invitation. I think, and congratulations for the original presentation to Martin and the study. I think you are managing to describe key elements, key messages on how to move forward in a very complex situation. We are now in our second energy crisis in 4 years. We should be mindful of that. It's extremely important to reduce our dependence from imported fossil fuels. I mean, if we look at the numbers since the Gulf War started 2 months ago, we have increased our import bill, the additional money spent in importing fossil fuels, in an amount of 27 billion euros in just 2 months. So the energy transition should be seen not simply as a decarbonization issue, but clearly a competitiveness and energy security imperative. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. If we look at, the numbers coming from our analysis towards 2040 that we are working this year in a post 2030 climate and energy framework. No, so we see that there is a major need for progress. We are speaking about almost tripling our current renewable shares in the system. doubling electrification, almost decarbonizing the power system with renewables and nuclear by 2040, increasing flexibility drastically in the system, reducing energy consumption by 1/3 while increasing electricity consumption. So this is like a major challenge, but something that we have definitely to do. And why do we need to do that? Because we see the clear impact that the energy transition, positive impact that the energy transition is having on prices. And I think it's been mentioned in a couple of the slides from Martin. I mean, we see generally lower prices in those member states that have higher shares of renewables plus nuclear. It's not always the case, but I think this is the general trend and the correlation. We see that gas and fossil fuels play a smaller role in those energy systems. And we must remind that, I mean, there are still 28% of fossil fuels in the power system. We have 72 renewables plus nuclear, but these fossil fuels set the marginal price of the electricity market in more than 50% of the hours, 52% of the hours, according to our calculation. So one of the key questions in this regard is, I mean, how to push those fossil fuels away from price setting, and of course, one of the clear replies is increase clean energy production. I mean, both renewables and nuclear working together. But also the question of flexibility is very important, because we must be aware that a large part of the clean energy investments in the system are solar. When the sun sets, solar stops setting the marginal price. So there is a need for other technologies, and there is a need for storage to be able to cover that demand. Now, going back to the original question on markets and the grid. Clearly, the internal market is the right vehicle to deliver on that vision, and the internal market has proven fundamental to deliver benefits for European citizens and companies. 34 billion euros a year. This is our estimation compared to a situation of no internal market. Now, the internal market needs to evolve in the direction of really supporting the energy transition. The implementation of the electricity market design from 2 years ago is crucial. The implementation of long-term contracts, CFDs, PPAs, to translate the benefits of those renewables to the final user. Bigger integration of the markets with a better use of, we often forget, but a better use of existing transmission capacities. I mean, the 70% rule is not about only building new interconnections, which of course we need much more from our perspective, but it's also about using what we have in the best possible way. So really offering these interconnection capacities to the market, giving the right locational signals to the market for the market to function properly. When it comes to, yeah, sorry.
I just want to know, because you said what we have is not used properly. Is that a pricing problem? Is it a coordination problem? Where is the problem there?
I think there is, in European legislation, there is a rule to offer to the market 70% of the transmission capacity, to offer it for trade. This is not happening in many cases. I mean, this capacity is being not put in the market. So from the potential capacity that you can put in the market to what's put in the market in the end by TSOs, given different reasons. So we are not delivering on that rule. If we were like really giving more capacity to the market, it will help to increase the flexibility of the different markets. It will bring prices closer, and it will act as additional infrastructure being in the market. Now, this is the use of existing capacity is not the only problem. Clearly, we need to have new infrastructure and new interconnections also new infrastructure at distribution level to be able to support the energy transition. And we are talking in our numbers about 75 billion euros of investments in electricity infrastructure a year, both transmission and distribution. The investment pace is much slower than that. So how we can make that happen? And clearly the grids package is one important reply to that. And on that, I think the grids package is working on the planning side, on the cost sharing side, on the permitting side of things to accelerate infrastructure. And of course, it's very important that these negotiations between Parliament and Council proceed smoothly so that we can really implement in practice the grids package to make those investments happen. And there is no time to lose from our perspective. This is something that not only the Commission says, I mean, the Draghi report from almost 2 years ago already made a very strong point on the need to develop infrastructure for competitiveness purposes. And this is, from our perspective, the direction to go.
And do you see that with the energy crisis now, is there a renewed push that member countries say, oh, now we really need to do it in order to, in the longer term, have lower energy prices, may make progress on decarbonization? Or is it more moving minds elsewhere?
No, absolutely. I think we see with the energy crisis a stronger push for accelerating the energy transition, a stronger push for more interconnectivity and working together, cooperation. This is widely acknowledged at EU level. Now the question is how to make it happen, and the devil is on the details. I mean, this is a complex legislative proposal which is under negotiation with Council and Parliament. Different member states, different parliament groups have different priorities and different conditions. And as with any legislative proposal, I think the key is to be able to converge as quickly as possible into a solution that delivers on the original goals of the proposals and that it's fit for purpose. And this is what we are trying to do with Council and Parliament to try to come up with a close and a positive close of those negotiations by the end of summer. And it's ambitious, it's challenging, it's technically complex, but it needs to happen if we want to move forward.
Thank you, Antonio. Frauke, I think I would, now that I was listening to all of this, and of course it's very complex, but yeah, and to that point, I mean, in some ways, the problems that Allegra talked about are, yes, they're about capacity expansion. Then Antonio was talking also about capacity use. But isn't the problem also a bit that we are completely changing the system from something where, we had big generation capacity, you could plan that, you just put it to the grid, and now everything is going to be decentralized, storage here, they want to get access to the grid, everybody wants to get electrified. We were already talking about, should we transport a renewable energy, or is there more room, or is it even better, more efficient to produce more locally? And then these people, we are arguing about households, when should they be allowed, or under which conditions to feed their energy that they generate, the electricity, into the net. Is that also a big problem? So the coordination to come from one system that's based on big capacity, fossil fuel based, and now everything is decentralized, new technologies. People are also solutions queuing, right, in order to get grid access. So is it the case? And then what's the solution? Do we need more of European-wide oversight? How can it be managed, this transition?
Thanks. And I think in short, Nicola, indeed, the answer is yes. The system is changing very fundamentally. And if we try to manage it in the old, well-known ways, we'll lose a lot of efficiency. And there's a lot, at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity in those changes in the system that we're currently not really making the most of. And maybe if I start with the angle about how much top down, how much bottom up, the decentralized nature of things. Also because I kicked off with this interconnection piece. We will, and we are seeing a system that is a lot more decentralized, where we have both small scale local generation, but also storage, flexibility potentials that we can tap into. We will also have some larger offshore wind generation, for example. Countries that go for it have their nuclear plants. And what does that mean? We need both the local optimization, but also the European perspective interconnection. Just if you look at the weather patterns, wind traditionally produces or typically produces more in winter, solar more in summer. We have different wind patterns in Northern Europe than we have in Southern Europe. Interconnecting the continent helps us massively with seasonal variations to make the system a whole lot more efficient, reduce the need for some kind of thermal backup in the winter because we can balance across regions. So interconnection does help make the system that is, for the largest part, renewables based, more efficient. But we should not overlook the fact that most of the music is in the local. I mentioned the decentralized generation, the decentralized flexibility. We currently are not nearly tapping into these options sufficiently. And I would like to maybe flag three elements there. One is the pricing structures. We still have, in most parts of Europe, very big price zones, sometimes not really reflecting the status of the grid. Of course, Germany pops in many people's minds, Germany having one price zone. It's a complicated matter, but we've got to look at it basically rationally and objectively. What we've done at Agora was we've looked at real data and just assumed if we had 22 pricing zones in Germany instead of one, what would the market have looked like? What would, well, the reality have been? Just looking at real weather data, everything else, production data. What we found was that basically, so just putting Germany spends in 2023, I think it was, Germany spent 3.2 billion euros on redispatching, basically curtailing power in the north that had bid into the market, ramping up gas in the south in order to meet demand that was basically allocated through the kind of one bidding zone. Now, we basically looked, what if Germany had 22 pricing zones? How would behavior look? What would the costs look? What we found was that on average, Germany would be saving some 6 euros per megawatt hour of power across the system. What does that translate into? That translate into, if Germany had those local bidding zones, most of European consumers would be better off. But we would see very targeted areas where we'd have problems. That is parts of especially Southwest Europe, where consumers would be seeing partly higher prices with a bidding zone split, and wind generation in the north would partly see lower prices to be remunerated for their power output. However, if we use the congestion rents to cushion those effects, everybody would still be better off on average. Of course, things are not as simple as that, all granted, but I think we've got to look the facts into the eye and see, well, if these are the facts, then how do we design a politically viable strategy that helps us reap the benefits of better pricing signals, start with certain elements. And I haven't even gone into what that would mean for Europe as a whole and neighboring countries who are currently, I mean, if we look at Scandinavia, for instance, are very cautious about any kind of interconnection and grid expansion, saying, well, we know it would benefit in general, but as long as Germany has one price zone, it makes it very unattractive for us. So local price signals, granular price signals, very important to optimize the use of the electric vehicles, the local capacities that we've got, because currently they are not interacting with the system in a way that benefits the system, but sometimes actually that counteracts the needs of the systems. Then we need flexibility needs assessment that take an integrated perspective. It's something that the European market design actually introduced in 2024, but that hasn't been implemented at member state level sufficiently yet. That could help, first of all, identify the flexibility needs and possibilities, include that in the resource adequacy planning, and leverage it. Also, then basically learning from that, include the flexibility options into balancing markets, capacity mechanisms, everything else, to make sure that we leverage this huge potential that we've got in this new system. And then the last one is data and visibility in the system, because without a more digital grid, it's going to be very difficult to leverage all these possibilities that we've got. And it starts with simple things like smart meters, to be able to tap into the potentials that we've got. Those are just some of the elements. There's more in terms of power electronics, running a system with lower rotating masses. It can all be done. The technologies are there, but it means changing our approaches.
Yeah, thank you, Frauke. And Martin, I think well, you're already very active in the chat, but I was just wondering, because you didn't mention it, did you recommend more local pricing in the report?
I mean, it was not a key recommendations, but yes, we go into the direction of more local pricing.
Yeah, I can ship
And
in one anecdote to that. I remember I once went on an OECD fact-finding mission to Poland, and I met my namesake, Jacek Brandt, who was the head of the energy agency in Poland at the time. And he greeted me with the words, "All of our problems come from Germany."
which is basically why we probably didn't have it as a key recommendation.
Well, I'll come back with some other question, but perhaps related to that, Philipp, perhaps you can tell us, why is it, if it's beneficial, with, of course, losers, winners and losers, well, maybe you can speak more freely these days. Why is it so difficult politically to go there, to have more local pricing?
Well, I mean, I think the political debate is quite clear in Germany, and you said all problems come from Germany. I'm not sure if I would agree, but
my namesake says that.
But some would say, I mean, it's a northern-southern divide in Germany, of course, and in the southern Länder, of course, they fear that they would have to pay higher prices, what they probably would do. I mean, they can say with Frauke, and obviously in theory, I would agree, you can compensate that up to a point, and with efficiency gains and with other measures, like looking at the system more systemically. But this is something. I mean, from a like economist point of view, I would agree with Frauke. Frauke, of course, the Monopolies Commission has looked into that as well, and they said, okay, that would be, of course, bidding zone split would be the best. And then the question is, how many bidding zones do you actually create? How can you do that? Obviously, there's nodal pricing, which could be implemented as well. Not so much more easy in my opinion. And the third best possibility would be, in order for the price signals to have some effect and for this flexible system actually to work, of course, is dynamic pricing. That's what we are at. That's what the Bundesnetzagentur in Germany is at, with the so-called NEST process and the Agnes process. So they're actually reframing, or they're trying to actually rebuild the system, the pricing system, make it more flexible. There's a lot of resistance as well already, because industry says we cannot actually be flexible as we would need to be. So there's a lot of resistance, and I think we need to have a step-by-step approach, which could I think possibly, and this is something I think which need to be added, maybe include a little bit more a cross-sectoral logic, which means we're looking very much at the electricity sector as we know it, and we are instead that we're talking about, and the economics ministry in Germany is mentioning it all the time. We need to adopt a systemic view because we need to look at the whole energy system, not only the electricity market, the gas market, and the other markets. And I would tend to agree because more than 75% of total end energy in Germany and in Europe, the figures are not much different, is still molecular based. It's fossil based, and therefore we need to integrate it. Of course, we need to electrify everything that is possible, but still we can use molecules or molecule off-takers like electrolyzers also to stabilize the system and to actually deal with those fluctuations and try to make the system more flexible. So I would think, yeah, Frauke is right. Like in theory, I would tend to think that this is not something in this crisis time we are living in, with the poly crisis, the triple energy crisis. We're still witnessing the shocks of Russian attack on Ukraine. Now we have the Iranian crisis. We have US energy transactionalism. Actually, now we see the problems like creating a truly European electricity market already. And the resistances in all member states, actually. I mean, if you look at France and the French, let's say, reluctance to actually admit in any sector, be it molecules or electrons, really more interconnectors between Spain and France and Germany and so on, then we see we are really, we need to try to offer a way how does the political economy work. And here I would say, yes, let's have more system integration, let's have more flexibility, let's have overplanting, let's integrate molecules into the electricity system, let's have a more comprehensive view. Really, I'm fascinated by these discussions on electricity markets, but I'm sometimes having that a lot with molecules, of course. I'm thinking we should have really a more integrative view, integrating that as well. And that could help also to stabilize the market and maybe reduce reluctance actually to admit more price signals into the market.
Thanks. But it shows, also the anecdote I told, I told you about. I think it shows it's really a systemic change. And even what you're saying, Philipp, I think in the end or at the end stage, integrating sectors will make everything easier. But probably the transition is still difficult because you need to change rules, pricing mechanisms, I imagine. I have many questions, Frauke, to Allegra and Antonio, but you were raising your hand. So please, you wanted to react.
Thank you, Nicola. Yeah, I just wanted to react briefly to the point Philipp made, and I believe that we're not actually far away when it comes to the political realities. There is no way introducing 22 price zones or nodal pricing or whatever in Germany in the very, very short term. But it is something to be absolutely conscious of and lead towards. I did want to pick up on another keyword, and that is the crisis situation. Because I think in general, when we look at Europe, especially Antonio made the point, basically second crisis within 4 years. I feel uneasy to say, well, because of a crisis, we shouldn't be addressing the more fundamental questions. And I know that's not what you were suggesting, Philipp, either. But I still want to make the point looking at what member states are doing, because I think we see this dynamic again of patches of even partly counterproductive measures, and we are again. We've just been through it. We've learned from the previous crisis and said it was a bad idea to subsidize fossil fuel consumption in a fossil fuel crisis. Here we are. It's 2026, and we see so many member states doing the exact same thing again. Yeah, maybe there is no need to go into further detail. I think everybody here will nod to it and will agree. And yet, because the words were mentioned, I think it was crucial to make the point, and happy to expand further on it and where we go from it now. But I'm conscious there are other people who had their hands up.
Yeah, thanks, Frauke. Yeah, maybe, yeah, of course, it's always different how countries react in a crisis, but it's true. So coming back to a question perhaps that came from the audience, which was about what you mentioned, Antonio, that the existing capacity often is not used. And Martin already answered, but maybe it's interesting also to discuss. He said national regulators often provide derogations, right? And you can tell us whether that's your viewpoint too. But it comes back to the system approach, right? We heard in many areas permitting, grid access rules, pricing, will probably have to change because just the system is changing and is more deregulated. And Europe will overall benefit from a more integrated system. But do you, as the EU, have sufficient power to foster this system change? Or is this, I mean, it's normal that every country has its path dependency, right? And it's difficult to agree. But you're not going to say no if I ask you, do you want more power? But just the coordination issue, is that something that's difficult to make progress? And perhaps more specifically on this not providing interconnection capacity or capacity to the market, is that a coordination issue between national regulators, would you say?
Well, I mean, there is no single answer for that. There are a number of reasons for TSOs not offering this 70% of cross-border capacity to the market, and the reasons range from internal congestions, grid constraints that some people might push to the border. It's true that there are also transitional derogations foreseen. There are a number of cases where there are loop flows and schedule flows that have an impact on that. So I think the picture is mixed. There are member states that go ahead and are close to the target, others that are doing less efficiently. So, but this is, I think the point I wanted to make was like, this is in parallel to looking for new transmission capacity, which is very much needed. We need to ensure that whatever we have is used in the best possible way. And this is a point of enforcement of existing legislation. We are often in cases where we all agree at council level and parliament level on a set of rules, but then those rules are not fully transposed by member states, and it takes a lot of time to get there. And I'll put you an example. The rules on permitting for renewables that were agreed 2 years ago, already 3 years ago. I mean, they've been implemented by few member states, and Germany is one of them that have decided to implement to the maximum possible level what comes from European legislation, and you could see the positive benefits in acceleration of renewable energy projects in Germany. In other cases, it has not happened. So there is a clear point of enforcement of existing legislation. Now, on the coordination, definitely we can do better in terms of coordination, and this is what we are trying to do in the current crisis. For example, we published last week the Accelerate EU communication, which is the Commission response to the ongoing crisis from an energy perspective. And the first point that we make there is the need for a stronger coordination between member states in this crisis situation. And this applies all across the board. Energy is a shared competence in the treaties, so it's obvious that the Commission cannot do everything by itself. There is a lot to be done at national level by member states, and there is a lot to be done by means of cooperation. We have, for example, a very useful tool for cooperation with member states, which is the Energy Union Task Force, which we launched last year with Affordable Energy Action Plan. And there we are discussing about real things, real problems, bottlenecks on the energy transition that we discuss with member states and try to find common solutions. Now, one last point I wanted to make from our response to the crisis. I mean, very much market and grids related. In the Accelerated EU communication, we flagged that we will adopt a legal proposal on network charges and taxation in the coming future, normally in May. I think the goal with that legal proposal is make network charges much more efficient and conducive to investments in the energy transition, while reducing network costs in the medium and long term, and also lower taxation for electricity. One should recall that at the end of the day, and I think you mentioned it in the original presentation, Martin, that taxes, levies, but also network charges are a very important part of the final electricity bill, of the retail electricity bill. In some cases, might be almost close to half, 2/3, close to half in some member states of the electricity bill. So it's very important that we keep a close eye on that, apart from obviously everything that has to do with the wholesale market.
So then let me ask quite directly before I move on, Antonio. I mean, there's no, we are all agreed, sort of, or everybody seems to be agreed that really you have to think about European electricity and energy markets more in an integrated way. And you said sometimes that the capacity is not offered to the market is an enforcement issue, or other rules also are not transposed as they should be. Would it be needed to have a European energy electricity regulator with more enforcement capacities, or would that just lead to more disagreements? Well, we have it in financial markets in some ways. Would that help?
I think there are obviously issues on the governance of the electricity markets that might need to be looked at more from a long-term perspective. But that's not a point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make now, it's more about enforcement of existing legislation. Only through enforcement of existing legislation agreed by Council and Parliament, by all member states, I mean, we will be able to accelerate massively the energy transition and foster the integration of the markets. And I think this is a reality check somehow that we all need to do. We are good at creating new legislation. At the end of the day, I think there is a gap in what we implement. Perhaps there is a reason to explain that. I mean, the pace of the energy transition and how energy markets is evolving has nothing to do with the past, no? I mean, 20 years ago, things were slow. You could afford having a 2-year negotiation of a directive and then a long implementation period. We don't have the luxury any longer. With the fast-paced environment and the need to reduce dependencies, it's extremely important that we act at member state level for the benefits of citizens. Here, it's not about meeting targets any longer. It's not about delivering on EU legislation as such. No, it's delivering competitiveness and independence for Europe. And this is what this is about.
Thank you, Antonio. Allegra, now to you. I think I mean, we talked a little bit about competition in different areas, but I was wondering, since you are supporting sort of market newcomers with new solutions, and they need everything, right? They need fast permitting procedures and land use planning that allows them to enter, grid accession rules, etc. So much of this is probably regulation. But that's related to competition. So my question is competition, how it's designed in the European energy and electricity market. Is that conducive to new entrants and to innovation taking place? Or should the system be rethought a little bit, the regulation, also perhaps competition oversight, in order to make for a more decentralized system with more new technologies that can enter the market more easily?
Good question. Personally, in the portfolio companies that we have in the different, I would say, grid component, I haven't seen competition to play a major role in accelerating them. when it comes to stakeholders or solution that pertains to the grid, first and foremost, the hurdle is of a regulatory nature, unfortunately. And so it's how we price energy, how we access the grid, how we interconnect, and everything that we've discussed today. And unfortunately, I think that competition is kind of a lower degree of magnitude on the impact it can have on the rise of those innovators and how they can more effectively use existing capacity and help to build out the grid further.
And you said, given that energy prices are so high in Europe, I mean, there are also opportunities, right, for innovators to come in order to lower those energy prices. Does
Absolutely.
it in some ways make it a more interesting market, this crisis?
Yes, and I think that and was grateful for Frauke to remember us about the mistakes that we made at the time when the war in Ukraine unfortunately began, because we had at that time kind of a painful opportunity to transition and to increase our energy security. But instead, what we did is we both LNG terminals that that weren't cheap, quite the contrary. And unfortunately, as now we have another reminder of that with the Strait of Hormuz being blocks, we are again looking into subsidizing fossil fuel rather than saying, well, the solution, when we look at the data, lies in reducing a dependency to fossil fuels that we import and increasing the share of renewables to build up on our own sovereignty and to decrease prices. So I hope that this time, European member states will see the common interest and rather than protecting their own market.
Well, Frauke, we have a bit of more time, and I think that's the moment for you to go into what you didn't expand before. Also, because there was one question. So, how, in this context, how to think about emissions trading system 1 and 2, and because there's also sometimes an impulse to halt it or maybe lower it when prices go high. I mean, on the other hand, of course, the price signal is clear that will help innovation and decarbonization, but it's of course also a heavy bill on consumers sometimes. Philipp talked a lot about the political economy of making progress. So how to balance that? How to stay on track when there's really strong shocks that, yes, can help systems make progress, but are very hard on many players when they hit in that way.
Yeah, I mean, first looking at the emissions trading and what's really driving up prices at the moment. Well, the largest chunk of what's driving up prices is the fossil fuel price and not the emissions trading. So first putting things into perspective, in some ways, even the emissions trading has, or the emissions allowances have a buffering effect, if you will, because as soon as fossil demand decreases, which it does with rising prices, the prices for emissions allowances relax and go down because they are linked to the volume of fossil consumption. So in a way, the ETS prices, the allowance price, has gone down during the crisis because of this kind of cushioning effect that fossil consumption and ETS have on each other. So that's an important, just to put things into perspective and see what is really driving the prices. Now, of course, the price of emissions is a price that, in the end of the day, is paid by the energy users during the crisis and during non-crisis times. It's, as you were saying, Nicola, also a price that is driving the shift away from fossils into better alternatives. So for that reason, it's very much important and structurally a measure to help us reduce prices and reduce price effects because it's getting us out of this unpredictable fossil price dependence. Now, the ETS is also a source of revenue, of huge revenues. And the question is, how are these revenues used and to what extent can they also be used? And do they have to be used to go back to people? For ETS2, I think that's a very clear case. Just putting a price on heating and transport would be a huge mistake if we don't at the same time help people make the shift from a gas heater to a heat pump, from a combustion engine to an electric vehicle. So the money does have to go back in targeted ways to help make the shift, combined with social leasing models and other elements to support making the shift. And the same is true for ETS1, where still much too little of the ETS revenues is used to support the shift in industry, to move, for example, to electrified process heat and other elements. So these are the angles that we need, and especially in a moment of crisis, targeted support to help make the shift, reduce the dependence on fossil fuels are the best levers that we've got. Of course, during the acute crisis situation, there will also be, beyond the structural shift and investments, the request, how can we ease the pressure on consumers? And there, if financial support is needed, then please don't put it on fossil fuel prices, but channel it to vulnerable consumers, households, as well as industries in better ways. Just a general
Plea.
payment, yes, it's a plea, exactly. But just a general payment for households, for vulnerable households, I don't know, a heat cost support, but not on the price of gas, oil, but just as a general payment that they receive would be so much less destructive, especially also in terms of the market signals that are needed at the moment. We don't want to encourage people to consume more, but we also don't want them to struggle financially in ways that they can't deal with.
Thank you, Frauke. And we are past our time, and I think Allegra has to catch a train, but I want one last straw of hope from you, Philipp, because you know this business of negotiating across member countries quite well. And I'm just wondering, we heard that lots of the technologies are there, the solutions are there. It's not so easy to coordinate and implement them. But beyond some solutions that are being discussed now that make people in the panel less happy, let's say, do you think that there will eventually be this drive to coordinating the system change that is needed, or are we going one step ahead and two back?
No, I mean, I would agree with Frauke. I mean, I didn't mean when I said crisis times are difficult times. They are both difficult times, but of course they are chances time. I mean, if you see in crisis, we managed to undertake the biggest reforms and really to get going. So I think like studies like that who show like the merits of more market integration, more European integration, and of course also the benefit of the rollout of renewables. They can help to move to prepare us better for the next crisis and to make us more resilient. So I would say obviously we always need to, and this is a no-brainer in a way. Of course, we need to have the political economy aspects also prepared and in a way move step by step, but without, of course, neglecting the benefits of a more systemic and a more integrative approach in order to be prepared for the next crisis and not to stumble in it, because it's quite clear, and that it's not a purely economical argument, but of course resilience is key as well, and a more flexible decentralized energy system makes us more resilient, and therefore I do think that this crisis times are chances to move debates ahead. I would not think that we will see price zones in Germany very soon. but we should actually work progressively towards actually more flexibility, more market, and more price signals. And there are other elements we have discussed.
Perfect. I think that's a great conclusion. And I want to thank Antonio, Allegra, Frauke, Martin, and Philipp for, well, very illuminating discussions, and also the audience that enriched the discussions. 2 days from now, we are even going to continue. We are having another study that was posted in the chat by my colleague Ruben Marciano, where we go really into the governance of permitting, of land use rules, how you can change regulations also at the local level. There will be a transmission system operator talking, and energy, cooperative energy representatives. So that should be fun too. If you haven't gotten enough information today, there's more to come. But thank you very much and have a good day. I look optimistic to Europe's energy future now, thanks to you.
Bye-bye.